No, Sam was already face down in his unified pancake when Sentience started the conversation he had been aching to start. We will never make it alone. With a mouth full of food, but doing his best to hide the fact, Sam asked only a little bit sincerely, make it where? Sam sort of knew what these rabbits were getting at. The question was how long he could avoid the topic of this source. Sentience seemed to know his game, though, and those large, wide eyes narrowed on its prey. Have you not had enough? Sam was confused by this. He had just started eating, so that could not have been it. He stared blankly straight ahead, right through the large ears. If Sentience was talking about deeper spiritual things, it was to someone who had been so long in the muddy waters of aimlessness and defeat, but who had nevertheless made a permanent home there. The idea that there was another way to go about life was just as shocking as to discover that one's parents are not, in fact, their parents. What do you mean? It was Battle's turn. Sam, what is it that you seek? I want to get out of here. The verbal answer was clear enough. The truth of it somehow deterred from the mark. And do what? Battle was insistent that Sam face something he had no intention of facing. Go back. Oh. Sam put his head down and slunk back in his chair. The tears began to flow freely under the calm of the two rabbits, who had all along proved themselves consistent and available if he wanted them to be. No one spoke for a long time. Sadness, it seemed to the rabbits, was not just for Sam to bear alone. They held up their end of the sadness with him until he was ready to put it down and lift up that one thing that was something way better. After a long while, and all the tears Sam spent had formed themselves into tiny salty puddles in his saucer, he looked up at his two somewhat reckless friends. What you got? Walls down. Well, it's like this. Sentience squinted his eyes, still wet from compassion, but sparkling with joy. If there's a struggle, there must be a place of rest. Battle wanted in on the topic as well, and he wiped his eyes enthusiastically. If there is heartbreak, there must be such a thing as a whole heart. Sam started to maybe think these two had lost their marbles completely, but he let them continue. You see, Sam, Sentience let his voice drop to lay some emphasis on this particular point. No one can operate with half of the reality. At least Battle could sense this line of reasoning was sliding over Sam's head. We don't know how you do it or how anyone does it. Do what? Live without the whole truth. Battle was blinking ferociously. Sam was still unsure what they meant, but he felt the deep sadness he had just experienced being quickly replaced with a whelming over anger. Oh, you mean, what do I do now that Dad's gone? He started to get up from the table for the sole purpose of laying some more thoughts on it. What happens now that Mom's gone half crazy? He was just getting started, but he decided to share one other thought and see where it landed. Or what do I do now that the only person to ever understand me is... He couldn't finish, only slumped back down in his chair to stop himself. The tears weren't making a threat this time. It was the impulse to destroy the place that was raging. After a moment, Sentience looked at him straight in the eyes with his wriggling nose down, still aware that with a keen sense that his next words should not be wasted. We mean, there's a place to take the pain. Sam quickly vied to change the subject, despite the fact that he was in the middle of the very discussion that both rabbits meant to have with him from the beginning. Waits, no matter how excruciating they are like that. They have every intention of staying and making the one that has them feel like worse things would happen if they were let go of. And no matter how many times they've proved themselves unmanageable for any mortal to handle, they present a softer face when it appears their time is up. And so it went. What's the source? Sam's still steaming a bit from his reflections, but attempting to venture on a path he thought was off the topic. For the rabbits, though, it was the perfect question. Battle's unibrow lifted, also his ears. Well, now, he started. We were actually getting to that. What? Sam threatened another change of subject, but relented. In your world, Sentience explained, perhaps you call the source God. Grandma believed in God. Sam looked at the floor as his face flushed. We know. Battle and Sentience looked at each other. Is she here? Sam knew this didn't make any sense unless purgatory was real. and he would have had to have missed the part about personally dying if she was around. No, Battle and Sentience replied at the same time. She is with the source of all life, the one that started it all, with no pain, no sorrow, no brokenness, no trouble. She trusted, was accepted, and abides with him forever in a perfect place. Sam paused for a moment, staring at the two rabbits. What does he want from me? And Sam could barely get his mouth around the words. It seemed like there was a strange lack of mechanics necessary to formulate them. Where do people take pain? Still confused by the concept of taking pain anywhere, as if it could be contained in a basket or jar. The rabbits were speechless for a moment. While in the real world, this is nothing new for rabbits to have zero expressions to impart. For rabbit and sentience, this was groundbreaking. Sam fortified a plan of emotional escape. What do you think I should do? Pick it up and wash it in water? He rolled his eyes and crossed his arms. Yes, was all they could blurt out. Must be some kind of water. Sam still slumped in his fiend disgust. Well, it's not something we can do for you, Sentience entered. The rabbits squinted to each other as smiles emerged on their furry faces. Nope, Battle added. You have to find out for yourself. I met a man looking for a river. Sam again thought he was avoiding the topic, but at this, the rabbits leaped in their seats in sheer delight. He also talked about the source, didn't he? Battle and Sentience asked this in harmonized unison. Sam focused hard on the dirt floor in front of him as it suddenly dawned upon him that this was in fact the case. Was this some kind of conspiracy? He didn't trust anything that seemed too planned. Seemed like a lot of things that meant his ill were planned, like his dad now enslaved in a corporate workforce in prison, or like his mom planning to get rid of him and send him to his uncle behind his back. He had long learned to stay well clear of overly organized situations. What's his name? Sam was very clever at getting out of uncomfortable topics. He doesn't have one, Sentience responded slowly, shifting his large, cumbersome mass in the tiny chair that did not correspond to his size. What? The sound of that was very alarming to Sam. This was something he definitely wanted nothing to do with. He already felt invisible enough without inviting it upon himself. He follows the river so well, mused Battle as he lifted his eyes, rather in awe, to the dirt ceiling. Answering as one reading Sam's thoughts, he no longer knows it, or needs it. Weird, was the curt response from Sam. Yes, it is. The fur around Sentience's face seemed to be indicating that he was still chewing on something, an endless task for rabbits. For those that don't understand, Sam curled his eyebrows downward as he pondered whether or not he wanted to understand. It didn't take Sam very long to figure out as he sat silently in the rabbit's burrow, him staring at the dirt floor, and the rabbits, Sentience and Battle in turn staring at him, that action needed to take place. His options presented themselves as scant in number: hide, die, or follow. He didn't much like the idea of hiding inside a cave forever, nor did he appreciate what the blinder had in store for him, if he willy-nilly went for it, so to speak. The only option was to see what this source was all about, and to try to find that strange man with the fishing pole. After a long, somewhat awkward pause, Sam looked up and unveiled his final decision. So I guess it's up to me. He glanced at one of the dark tunnels that emptied into the tiny kitchen and remembered the last time he tried to run away without any instructions as to how to get out. It ended with overwhelming fear, birds, and a few fuzzy details after that. Sentience and Battle's noses signaled their Morse code response. How do I get out? This was just the kind of confidence they were looking for. Great, said Sentience. Let's show you how to get out of this dungeon. Dungeon? Battle was a little less apt to call this dirt hole a dungeon, but he also understood somewhat sheepishly the sentiment as a clump of mud fell from the ceiling on cue. Sentience saw the clump fall, barely missing a teacup. Yes, evenly addressed, without missing a beat. Dungeon. Sam smiled at the two. Battle quickly removed the dirt with a quick swipe of his paws under his arm, as if trying to fool the onlookers. If rabbits could blush, it would have been happening right then for the amusement of Sam and Sentience, per Battle's expense. This was exactly how Sam wanted to remember them. Strange it was to have to say goodbye to friends he never wanted or intended to make, but whose indelible mark would not quickly fade. Sam grinned widely and got up from his seat. "So I guess I better go," Sam announced with noticeable tone of apprehension. Sadness spread across the faces of the rabbits, but not without a mixture of pride. Then Sentience also stood in like-minded response, as if called up for duty. "We better show you the safe way out of our merry old dungeon," directing the last emphasis toward Battle. Battle in turn sniffed and rolled his eyes as he too got up from his tiny seat with less decorum, almost tumbling over completely in the endeavor. The rabbits turned and went first out of the tunnel, motioning Sam to follow. By degrees, Sam noticed that instead of finding a way that led upward, the rabbits were, by all accounts, going further down through the tiny corridors and tunnels. Far be it from Sam to presume here, but it logically made sense to him that to ultimately go up to the surface, which was the desired end, they should ultimately make a direction toward that way. Apparently, the problem of reaching the surface above them was more easily solved, according to the rabbits, by traveling further down. There was some kind of lesson in this, thought Sam. Are you sure we're headed the right way?" Sam was huffing and puffing at the way tag end of the line. Those rabbits' legs were powerful. "I guess we would know." Sentience was not taken in by any futile questions as he blazed through the dark tunnels. But, now rolling his eyes, along with huffing and puffing, Sam queried further, "Will this take us to the source?" "Not quite." Battle looked behind at Sam with a little twinkle in his eye, which changed suddenly to alarm as he tripped over a root. "No," Sentience continued, dodging a few clumps of dirt here and there, feeling the walls like he was reading a map written in Braille. He momentarily stopped on occasion, but not for very long, and after one of these ill-timed pauses that almost landed Sam in the back of Battle's fluffy tail end, he added, "You will be able to find it from where this leads." "Sure." Sam shooed some fur away from his face, more focused on the disaster that was narrowly evaded than on what Sentience was saying. "Okay." Both rabbits stopped, turned, and stared at Sam. "What?" asked Sam. Battle looked forward at Sentience for some kind of signal to say something. Sentience returned the look and then stared back again at Sam, squinting his big eyes. "What's going on?" Sam's enthusiasm over the untimely pause relinquished its hold momentarily as he was suddenly cognizant of a simple fact that caused him to cover his own mouth with wide-eyed amazement. "I'm not stuttering!" Battle Sentience said nothing, turned somewhat abruptly but contentedly, and continued on the indecipherable path. Well, only decipherable to rabbits. Sam's mind was in a whirl, and he could hardly keep up with the two cottontails in front of him. What did all this mean? Why suddenly? Was it because he chose confidence before there was a reason to be confident? Maybe that was this faith business they were talking about. Someone was for sure working on his insides and was on his side. He knew that he could feel the movement in there, right there in his heart, where there was absolutely nothing before. "I thought I would live with that my whole life," Sam said, panting from behind, striving almost fruitlessly to keep up. This declaration was more reminiscent in form, and Sam was not really concerned with whether or not it would reach the long ears in front of him. "Not for you," Battle continued, hopping along without looking back, apparently marked with a short cough. "When will we get there?" With all this freedom to speak, Sam was sure he would have a lot to say in the near future. He just didn't quite know how to grasp it all yet. But even this preliminary liberty was fantastic. "We're there," Sentience, in tune to Sam's thoughts, answered from the front. "We are?" Sam tried to look through two sets of fluffy tails and long ears to see what Sentience saw as sure sign that their destination had been reached. "Yep." Battle sighed a deep sigh and leaned against the cave wall. Sam finally caught a glimpse of some light at the far end of the tunnel, a straight way out that didn't involve any cave roofs caving in or birds carrying him out and dropping him on a pile of grass. He could walk out without fear, on his own 2 feet, right out of these dark tunnels, just like that. "We can't tell you." Battle heaved a sympathetic sigh. "We can only show you the way, which I understand can seem very threatening for you." Sentience added slowly with a slight air of uncertainty as to how it would be received. "We know you have been through a lot." Sam was a little frustrated. It would have been nice to know he wasn't being pushed along by rabbits who appeared not to care about his history. They just kept pushing him into the abyss, kept requiring more of him, when all he could think about was his dad, his mom, his grandma, and his pending move. We could have cried with you for days, Battle blinked in earnest, but it would not have gotten you here. Sentience again, he finished Battle's thoughts. Sam reflected on how caving into self-pity would have probably ended up with them all in a totally different place, how he might have been blinded by now, or sleeping on the dirt floor of their den still, again, or caught up in some tree waiting to die, with those stupid leaves singing in his ears. Still, pain was pain. Now as Sam's thought sentience was reading, pain lets us know something is broken, but letting it drive us leads to a lot of destruction, Battle huffed, stretching a bit as he added his bit, like playing mental telepathy tennis. Destruction leads to destruction, leads to destruction. Sam breathed out his reply, heaving with personal knowledge, knowing all about that topic. Do you think things will ever go back to the way they were for me? His question struck the final chord, an accumulation of all that had transpired until now that he was staring down a hopeful yet unknown destination beyond the opening of the cave, highlighted with the brightest of glows, but still bathed in steep mystery. Do you? Sentience asked, his eyes for the first time scouring the ground as if there was something to find in the dirt and something of an uncomfortable moment to avoid. No. Sam was slow in his response. I don't think it will. Are you sure that's a bad thing? Battle continued in kindly fortitude. Or maybe, Sam, Sentience met his eyes with compassion. It's just going to be a different thing. And maybe, Battle was now on all fours with his nose pointing to the direction of the cave's opening, motioning Sam forward. A very good thing. Tears seeped through the corners of Sam's eyes as quickly as he blinked them away in the bright sunlight. It was not a long goodbye. The rabbits were determined to make it less dramatic and traumatic, promising that somehow he would know they were always and forever around. They looked forward to seeing him thrive, seeing him move forward, and proceeding headlong into his purpose, and they told him so. Though Sam was not entirely sold on all those things, after all, the future was a bit broad at 12 years old to nail it down to anything in particular. He was thinking purely of what he wanted to be when he grew up, maybe a fireman, businessman, chef, who knew? He was not thinking of what the rabbits were thinking about, a restored and whole individual able to do whatever he wanted. So Sam stood on the outside of the tunnel, unable to avoid the overwhelming sensation that comes with the unknown, the sensation that always feels like trauma for the one who was raised in trauma, unable to distinguish the healthy unknown from the unhealthy chaos. Older people that have struggled with trauma find a way of avoiding situations way in advance that involve this sensation, living their lives with nothing new on the horizon by choice. Any jolt out of the mundane is met with an equal force of determined obstinance to stay right where they are. Sam was given a chance here. He knew that. So as the wave of the unknown flooded over him, he looked around to see what he could find in the way of the source. The next step. He was leaning out to trust, learning to lean into the unknown. Where? He whispered to himself, but not without fervor. He was looking not because perhaps he missed the fact that there was a huge river in front of him. No, there was no river in sight. But instead of getting discouraged, he looked for a tiny stream that might lead to it. No sign of any water flowing anywhere. So he stopped to listen. There it was, distinct from the soft sounds of the wind whizzing past his ears, was the sound of running water. Just a small trickle, like fresh water bursting from a spring. But all streams led to the ocean, it was said, or the source in this case. He let his ears guide his feet and his eyes. As he searched, he wondered if he would meet the same man with the fishing pole. He wondered how long it would take to find the source, and what would happen once he did. The leaves around him made whirling noises and rushed up in the air and flew back down. But this time the leaves were not singing. They had no directions to give, no high notes to sing harmony to. They just danced in the air with thick anticipation. Was it anticipation or angst? Sam could sense his thoughts were at the door of panic, rap, tap, tapping, as if Sam was not careful, a whole flood of fear was going to take over. Then he heard the breaking of a twig behind him. The choice was his now. Would he turn around? What if it was the blinder? What if it was nothing? What if the blinder was coming? Was he in danger? What could he do about it? No. He steadied himself on his feet and looked straight ahead with all the bravery he could muster, fully confident the rabbits had led him to the right place. The only way out of fear was to walk out. Now let's see, he whispered to himself. Aha, there it is. As he was looking at the tiny rushing stream, he simultaneously felt flooded with joy. He sat by it on the cool grass and took his shoes off. He had to know what it felt like on his feet. Few children can avoid playing in the water, and he was no different. Boy and stream stood almost looking at one another, but one of them had places to go, and dashed against the smooth down rocks, overhangs, mossy green curbs, and over small falls. It was all too exciting, like he had never seen the rushing water of a stream before. What was so different about this, he didn't know, but he stood in the middle of it, unashamed. Sam was running now, down the stream with his shoes abandoned on the banks. His only thought was that he wanted to experience all there was to experience. He wanted to know what the fisherman looked for so intently. He wanted to realize that kind of urgency for himself. Sam might have stubbed his toe on a rock or two, and he had to duck under a few branches, and once he almost slipped into the stream altogether, but he remembered none of these things when he caught a sight of the river that flowed in front of him. It took his breath away. He there paused. The roar of the rushing water overwhelmed his ears. The brightness and clarity of the shimmering cascades almost hurt his eyes, but he just knew with eerie, inescapable feeling that he did not belong. The freedom of the flowing water and the cripple-hearted boy were altogether different. He never before felt such vast difference between himself and something or someone else. The reality overwhelmed him. He heaved a heavy sigh, fell to the soggy ground, and wept like he had never wept before. The tears were a constant flow, just like the waters of the river. He felt sure everything around, if it was living, was uncomfortable at the sight of him, but he didn't care. All this distance, all the pain, all the treachery, now all the climactic disappointment, so close yet so far. It could not be. It just could not be. "You there!" Sam froze, wiping his tears from his eyes hastily. He looked up to see a familiar figure with a fishing pole in hand staring at him with his same piercing eyes. "Hi, It wasn't his stuttering that was emerging again. It was the utter discomfort. He had no clear idea of what to say or how he could explain himself. There was no explaining himself. He wanted to get up and run. In fact, he didn't know what exactly kept him nailed to the soggy ground in a huge heap of discomfort. "I see you found my river." The fisherman squatted down to peer further into Sam's uncomfortable soul. "Sort of." "What do you mean, sort of?" Sam was pretty sure he was staring right at the object of the conversation, therefore had found it. The fisherman grunted. "It's not meant to be stared at." Sam was confused. "Fished in?" Even as the words came out of his mouth, Sam knew that couldn't be right. The fisherman's grunt turned into a roar of laughter and a wide smile. "Once you experience it," the awkward man settled himself into a seated position, betraying his vast admiration of the raging river. "You center your life around it. That's where the fishing come in." He smiled again from ear to ear, bellowing over the top of the waves. "Whew! If that ain't hard work, 'tisn't the weak meat for the weak need. No, sir. You are not easy to keep up with." He was now addressing the water like a friend. Sam tried with all his might to see what the fisherman saw, with his eyes so full of peace and assurance, love and stability. His face glowed somehow in stark contrast to Sam's apprehension toward the foreboding waters. He would have guessed it was the reflection from the fearful river, but yet he knew there was more to it. The man's tone changed to that of reflection. "Fishing come after, though. Some do try to do the fishing before." He continued his thoughts while shaking his head softly. "Makes no sense at all." He heaved a heavy sigh and looked sideways at Sam. "So?" Sam jolted with the pressure. "So what? Are you going to jump in?" The man looked strangely jubilant about offering that horrifying suggestion. I don't know." Sam was at once arrested by the choice that lay before him. The stuttering itself was rearing its ugly head through the door of his soul, as if mocking him. Was he to go back to everything he was, or jump in with full faith that change could and would happen? Sam shook himself at the obtuse contrast of light and dark. It was a quick and dreadful glimpse into what his life was about until now. He knew for certain that going back was not an option. "Promise I won't die?" "No, my dear friend," the fisherman squinted. "Quite the opposite." One small step along with a huge breath taken, and in Sam jumped with full abandon. Just like the fisherman said, there was no dying. There was only the washing of this fantastic flood over him, over his soul, over his life, over his wounds, over his regrets, over his greatest missteps, over everything. Just everything. In that moment, everything changed. He could almost watch all the mess and filth that threatened to drag him to hell, that meant disaster for him, get swept down the stream, replacing it with a huge smile on his face. Joy of joys, he was free. So, the fisherman stood up with laughter that echoed Sam's. His name is Jesus, was all that Sam could say. All at once, everything was gone. The river, the fisherman, the leaves, the hedge, all of it. Sam stood there in the vacancy, staring at the backyard of his grandma's house unchanged. There wasn't even the slightest alteration of the patio furniture since the last time he saw it, which seemed like years before. There was someone emerging from the back sliding glass door, however, someone he had never seen before. Sheer curiosity drove him to meet the stranger, even if just to stop at hollering distance. "Hello?" Sam called out. "Hello there!" The warmth of his tone was very inviting indeed, so Sam ventured further to close in the gap. "Do I know you?" Sam thought the question appropriate since the man had just come out of his house. "No, sir. No, you don't." The mysterious man laughed loudly, putting Sam at further ease. "I'm your mama's brother, your Uncle Emery." Sam froze. No more closing in the space, no more returned smiles, no more interaction. It was the large, jovial Uncle Emery who braved the dark winds of emotion that gathered around his nephew with a sudden, unrelenting jolt. Of course he knew discourse was now flailing. Of course he knew Sam was probably thinking the worst of him. Of course he knew Sam had no interest in moving. Of course he knew all this. But still he walked right up to Sam, squared with him at eye level, and whispered the words Sam would never forget. "I'm not just your uncle, Sam. I'm your friend." Sam was melting under his gaze, but the sustaining power of his new faith held him up. Where once he would have melted off into oblivion, in turn acted out, thus repeating the same destruction, he just stood there. He remembered the rabbits, he remembered the fishermen, he remembered the change that took place, and he knew what really mattered about that time was never going away, no matter where he ended up. Blinking, Sam thought he should at least lay down some facts about himself in case there was going to be any question. "I met Jesus." "You have?" Uncle Emery's mouth broadened into a large toothy smile. "That is fantastic news. Otherwise I would have had to tell you about him myself. I don't go nowhere without him." He stretched himself upright. "Phew, that's settled." Sam was now grinning, not because he knew the future, not because everything was perfect, not because life came with instant answers, because of who was with him. And it wasn't Uncle Emery, his mama, or even his grandma. God rest her soul, it was Jesus. And it would be Jesus from here on out, every single time. "Ready to pack your bags?" His Uncle Emery gave Sam a sideways knowing look. "No." Sam looked, meeting his same expression, easing off with a grin. "Ha!" They both headed into the backyard of the tiny pink house. "That's right. I don't blame you. But it's going to be great. I know it." The end.